Chapter 6, Mishnah 6. This is the long one. In fact, it's so long that I've noticed in some versions, they actually split it into two Mishnahs, which is very interesting because it's one topic, so I'm not sure how you split it, but I've seen that some do that. And it's such a long Mishnah that in all likelihood we certainly won't finish it in one session, but in all likelihood we may not even get to the main part of this Mishnah today. Why is that? Because this is the Mishnah that says, it starts off by telling us, Gedola Torah. Torah is great. Yoiser min hakahuna, min hamalchus min hakahuna. Torah is great. It is even greater than royalty and than priesthood, being a kohen. Okay? And then it tells us, because שהכהונה נקנס ב-24 מיילות, והמלכות נקנס ב-30 מיילות. Which basically means that when a person is a kohen, because you can't become a kohen, you either are a kohen or you're not a kohen. So when a person is a kohen, that comes with 24 milos. How would you translate the word milos? You say somebody has many milos. What are you saying? There? Degrees. The direct translation of the word milos is actually degrees. In fact, it's actually a geometrical term. Milos, so degrees. But what it means when we use it in reference to character is we're talking about attributes. Or milos comes from the word mila, something which is above something else. So 24 ways in which a person who is a kohen is elevated over the rest of the community, and the king in 30 ways. V'hatorah niknes be'aboim u'shmoina milos. Dvarim, it says Dvarim. This is very important. One of the most important parts of the Mishnah. And Torah is acquired through 48 attributes. Okay, so the kohen 24, the king 30, and Torah 48. From there we realize that Torah is greater than both Malchus and Kahuna. It is greater than royalty, and it is greater than being a kohen.
Isn't it obvious?
Nothing is obvious. Why does it have to be? The king is the greatest person in the community.
The king can't write the laws.
Yeah, sure the king can.
No, but not how Hashem did it.
Okay, so you're saying that Torah is great, but here we're talking about what it takes to become a master of Torah versus what it takes to become a king. That is not so obvious. It's not so obvious. So what we're going to try and analyze over here is we need to understand what these three things are before we jump into this. And that's why I say we may not get into the list, because obviously we're going to get into the list of the 48 things. What are the 48 things? And the word is things, devarim, as opposed to milos. So the king and the kohen are identified by milos, which are attributes or assets, whereas the Torah is identified by devarim, by things. So we have to understand that difference, why we're using two different words. But before we get into any of that, you cannot tell me that something is greater than something else until I appreciate what something else is. Right? So for example, if somebody had to come along, and kids come home sometimes and there's some new game at school and they start trying to explain the game to you. And they say, I'm this in the game and I'm that, and you have no idea because you don't know what any of the things are, so it's meaningless. You have to have context. In order to appreciate what the greatness of Torah is, we have to have a sense of what royalty is and a sense of what kahuna is. That's going to be a big part of this conversation. The other thing we have to try and understand is the significance of 24 things, 30 things. So we're going to get a list of the 48 things that are associated with Torah. But where do you find the 24 things of the kohen, and where do you find the 30 things of a king? And what's the significance of those numbers? Why are those dafka the numbers that are chosen? Okay, so this is what we have to unpack. So let's start first and foremost with the famous story, which I'm sure you've heard numerous times, the story of the man who comes to his rabbi. Rabbi, I want to be a kohen. Another story? Rabbi, I want to be a kohen. The rabbi says, unfortunately, that's not an available option. You can't choose to become a kohen. He says, Rabbi, I have to be a kohen. That's incredibly important to me. And you have to help me. I'll do whatever it takes. If I need to learn something, I'll learn it. If I have to attend shul X amount of times, I'll do it. Whatever it takes, I need to become a kohen. And the rabbi says to him, I'm sorry, it's just not an option. can't just become a Kohen. He says, Rabbi, how much is it going to cost? Let's talk tachlis. How much do I need to donate? And then you'll make me a Kohen. Eventually, the rabbi says to him, listen, what is your obsession? There is no way to buy the position. There is no way to earn the position. There's no way to graduate into the position. Why are you so obsessed with being a Kohen? He says, what do you want, Rabbi? My father was a Kohen. My grandfather was a Kohen. I also need to be a Kohen. And the message really is that you cannot become a Kohen. You either are a Kohen or you're not a Kohen. It's not something that you can graduate to. It's not something you can marry into. It's not something you can download. It's not something you can purchase. Either your genealogy is a Kohen or it's not. That's how it works. It's what we call yichus. It's your lineage. The only exception, there's only one person in the whole of history who was not originally a Kohen and was later upgraded to become a Kohen, and that's Pinchas, and that's because of a very unique story. So a Kohen is an inherited position.
But he was a Levi, wasn't he?
Yes, he was a Levi. That's true. He was kind of close. Okay, fair enough. Next question. So you cannot become a Kohen. That's the first thing that's clear. Can you become royalty? How? What you can marry? You can marry into royalty, yes? Okay. So let's just test that for a second. In Judaism, and I hate to say this because it's going to get a whole lot of people's heckles up, but in Judaism, is there such a thing as a queen?
No.
So, exactly. We're all kings. We're all royalty. Kol Yisrael b'nei melachim. The Gemara tells us that the whole Jewish nation is royalty. But is there a position? Is there an actual royal position called the queen in halacha, in Judaism? It's the wife of the king. But it's not a status. That's not a Jewish story. That's the Persian system. Esther is a queen in Persian culture. But we don't really have Jewish queens. I mean, we have Shlom Tzion. I mean, you have one or two kind of pop out. But in the system, it's not automatic that you marry into the royal family and you become a royal. Because remember that kings could have multiple wives. So you don't automatically become royalty because you marry into the family. So can you become royal? If it's not in your lineage, can you become royal? In fact, even if it is in your lineage, just because your father was a king, does it mean you're a king? No. What's the key? What is the key to becoming a king? What's the most important factor without which it is impossible to be a king?
From the lineage perspective.
No.
No, from the Torah.
No.
With the oil.
You've got to be anointed. Even that not. The Rambam says clearly that the only time you have to anoint a king is either when it's the first in the lineage or when there is conflict over who should be the next king and you have to determine who's the next king. So then you have to anoint them. But what's the key factor to become a king? Okay, let me try this a little differently. What do you say?
You inherit them.
You inherit, that's lineage. So let me ask you a simple question. There you go. You cannot be a king without a nation. You know what we do with people who claim that they're royalty and nobody else thinks they're royalty? We give them a nice white jacket and put them in a padded cell. So, ein melech beloi am. The fundamental principle of royalty is that you cannot be a king without a nation. And the word am is a very specifically chosen word because there are various words that we could use for a nation, right? What are the other words we could use for a nation? Ummah. Ummah is a nation, right? Why do we use the word am? So one of the reasons we use it is because am has another meaning. It's when you take a coal out of a fire and you put it onto the side, and the coal begins to slowly burn out, that's called gecholim oimamois. Those are coals that are losing their fire because they've been separated from the fire. So the implication of the word am is, it has to be people who are naturally separate from you. It can't be your family. Your family can't call you the king and then you become the king. It has to be people who are independent of you, and only then do you become the king. So what does that tell you? It tells you that royalty is not something that you actually choose. You could be born into this system, you could be the heir to the throne, but if the people are not willing to have you as the king, you're not the king. So what that shows you is that both a kohen and a king are positions that are actually outside of a person's choice. You don't choose to become a Kohen, and you don't choose to become the king. In order to become the king, it's a two-factor authentication, right? You've got to have both the lineage and the acceptance of the community. In order to become a Kohen, you have to have the lineage. Now, what about Torah? Do you inherit Torah? No? No such thing. We learned this in a previous Mishnah. We said, She'eina Yerusha lachem. It's not your inheritance. Therefore, you have to work in order to gain Torah, and therefore it's technically open and available to everybody. So it seems a bit strange that we're making a comparison over here. We were saying Torah is greater than royalty and kahuna. Well, what's the lesson? If I had three choices in life, one choice was to become a Kohen, one choice was to become royalty, and the third choice was to learn Torah. And then you tell me, and Torah is greater than both of them, that would make sense. That would be advice. You're telling me that this is lucrative because you might want to be royalty, or that is attractive because you might want to be a Kohen, but I'm advising you that Torah is greater than both of them. That would make sense. But if I don't have a choice to become a Kohen, and I don't have a choice to become a king, what's the value in telling me that Torah is greater than them, and that Torah requires 48 steps, whereas they require 24 or 30 respectively? What's the lesson? Okay, you can tell me that without telling me about the Kohen and the king. Just tell me, work hard because Torah is valuable. So there clearly has to be some kind of a message over here that lies beneath the surface in the comparison between Torah on the one hand and royalty and kahuna on the other hand. So let's try and understand what is a Kohen and what is a king before we can have this conversation. So what is a Kohen? And please don't tell me a priest. What is a Kohen?
Someone who works in the Beis Hamikdash.
Correct. Somebody who works in the Beis Hamikdash. Now let's just test that for a moment. How regularly does a Kohen work in the Beis Hamikdash? There's 24 groups, and they're each for a week, which means that your Kohen works in the Beis Hamikdash on average twice a year, 2 weeks out of the year. So what is a Kohen?
Descendant of Aaron.
A Kohen is a descendant of Aaron, absolutely. So that tells us his lineage. But what does a Kohen represent?
Holiness.
Holiness. Holiness. And if you have a look in the Torah, when it describes Kohanim, that's one of the key things that it tells us, is that the Kohanim have to be holy and they have to be in a state of purity because of that holiness. And as a result, there's certain things that they cannot do. The most obvious is they may not become impure, because marriage hopefully is something that doesn't happen too often, but the opportunity to become defiled by contamination from a dead body could happen regularly, unfortunately. Going to the cemetery, attending a funeral, being in a hospital when somebody passed away. There are a whole lot of possibilities. So the Kohen has to be most vigilant about impurity, about staying away from dead bodies. Whereas marriage, yes, there are restrictions on who a Kohen may or may not marry, but that really only applies hopefully once in the Kohen's life. Whereas the impurity, all the time. What other restrictions are there? What other illustrations are there of the fact that a Kohen is a holy individual?
It gives that bracha.
He gives a bracha, that's true. The Kohanim are empowered to bless us. So that's obviously an indication that they have a certain sense of holiness. They can extend a bracha to the Jewish community. What else? Oh, let's put it differently. Now that we have established that Kohanim only really work in the Beis Hamikdash on duty, there might have been other jobs around the Beis Hamikdash that they would do more frequently, but their formal duties in the Beis Hamikdash are twice a week. So the obvious question is, what do Kohanim do all day? They're not allowed to work, exactly. They're not permitted to own land, and they're not permitted to work. The community has to support them. That's part of the role of the Kohen.
It's about meat.
That's true. The Rambam even says that the Kohanim were generally quite, they had sensitive digestive systems because they were eating a lot of meat. Now, why do they eat so much meat? Oh, I got it. Because the Kohanim are not allowed to work, so therefore they have to go from braai to braai. Right? No, seriously. So why they eat a lot of meat? The sacrifices are only available to the Kohanim on duty. So why they eat a lot of meat? Because there are gifts that we had to give to the Kohanim. Every single time we slaughter an animal, there's a whole forequarter that we have to give to the Kohanim. So imagine there's an entire Jewish population across the land of Israel who's constantly sending them meat. That's why they eat a lot of meat, besides the korbanos that they had to eat while they were on duty. Okay, so what does that tell you about Kohanim? Kohanim are the segment of the community that is separated from the material world to a large extent. They have to live in a secluded environment. They live together with the Leviim in the special cities that were allocated for them. They may not own land. They may not farm. They may not engage in regular business. So therefore, what do they do all day? The Kohanim study Torah all day. Now, isn't this interesting? Here we're telling that the Kohanim are not as great as Torah, but what do Kohanim do all day? They learn Torah. Most of the year, most of the time, they're studying Torah. So how does it make sense to say that Torah is greater than the Kohuna? How does that make sense? The Kohanim, most of the time, they're learning Torah. So we have to understand, what is a Kohen? What does a Kohen represent? Now, there's an interesting comment that the Rambam makes, and it's interesting also where he makes it, because it's out of context. It's not specifically in the context of the Kohanim. But the Rambam makes this comment, and he brings it in Mishnah Torah, which means that it is halacha. It's got a full legal application. He says that any person within the community who chooses to dedicate themselves completely to Hashem, in other words, to the exclusion of other activities, in other words, they're not going to involve themselves in the world, they're going to be completely dedicated to Hashem, any person can become like a Kohen. And the words that the Rambam uses is, Harei zeh niskadesh kodesh kadoshim. That individual has dedicated themselves with so much commitment to Hashem, with this absolute purity, with this absolute sincerity, without any distraction, without any engagement in the materialism of this world. That person is Kodesh Kadoshim, the Holy of Holies. What comes to your mind when you hear that expression, Kodesh Kadoshim, besides the place? The obvious reference is going to be the place, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, in the Beis HaMikdash. But outside of that, what else comes to mind when you think of Kodesh Kadoshim? Or maybe I should ask the question a little differently. How do we translate Kodesh or Kadosh? Separate, right? Exactly. Because the direct and correct translation of the word Kodesh is not holy, even though that's what we say, but it actually means separate. So, for example, what is the act when a man puts a ring on a woman's finger under a chuppah in front of witnesses? Doesn't even have to be under a chuppah, technically. When a man puts a ring on a woman's finger in front of witnesses, what is that called? Kiddushin. Why is it called Kiddushin? Because he has now separated this person from the rest of the community in the sense that they now have a unique relationship, and she is now forbidden to any other man in the community. She's been separated from the crowd and designated for somebody in particular. That's what Kodesh means. It means to be holy. What does Kodesh Kadoshim mean? It means to be separated. What does Kodesh Kadoshim mean? To be the most separated, the most unique, the most removed. So what is a Kohen all about? Whether it be the actual Kohen who serves in the temple, or whether it be the conceptual, spiritual Kohen that the Rambam says we could all become. How do you become a Kohen? Or how do you achieve what the Kohen's life is all about? What do you have to do? You have to separate. You have to separate from the world as we know it. Now, generally speaking, Judaism is not an ascetic religion. Generally speaking, we don't separate from the world. Right? Think about it this way. Very simply. When we have a holy day on the calendar, Yom Tov, coming up, how do we prepare for that Yom Tov? So, of course, we learn. We've got to learn the laws that relate to that particular Yom Tov. So there's the spiritual side of it. What else do we have to do to prepare for Yom Tov? We have to work on ourselves. Also depends which Yom Tov, to determine how we work on ourselves. What else do we have to do to prepare for Yom Tov? Cook. Exactly. Right? And God forbid anybody should go into Yom Tov having prepared anything less than the kind of meal that King Solomon would have enjoyed. So it's in abundance, right? What else do we have to do to prepare for Yom Tov? See, now that we've got cooking out of the way, everybody's stuck. What else do you have to do to prepare for Yom Tov? With what? Daven is every day, right? But what do we have to do to prepare for Yom Tov? Thank you. I was hoping somebody was going to say it. You have to buy new clothing. How do you prepare yourself for a spiritual day? By investing in the preparation of food and the purchase of fashion. Doesn't sound right. Because that's Judaism. Judaism is not a religion of separation. It's a religion of engagement. It's a religion which says you get involved in the physical world and you create spiritual meaning for physical things, right? So the Kohen is an outlier. Think about the entire population and the fraction of Kohanim. This is not mainstream. It's not the way that the general Jewish community behaves. You always have to have, in every system, you have to have those individuals who remain in a pristine state. Those are the Kohanim. They stay away from the world. They don't get their hands dirty. So that we could have one part of the community like the Shevet Levi in Egypt that were not slaves, because there has to be some part that are the custodians of Judaism, that keep the holiness holy, that keep us separate from the rest of the world, that our philosophies don't become contaminated. But it's not the way of the broader Jewish community. We have to engage in the world. Therefore, the Mishnah tells us that Torah learning is greater than the kahuna. In other words, what it's identifying is the way in which we learn Torah could have different motivations. Some people learn Torah because they want to be a kohen. Some people learn Torah so that they can learn a method of being separated from the world and completely invested in all the spirituality of Torah. That's why they learn. They want to be the kohen of Torah. There's no value in comparing our Torah learning to kahuna, which we could never attain. We can't become a kohen. It's saying there are two ways, there's three as we'll see, but for now there are two potential ways that a person could choose to learn Torah. One is to learn Torah for the kohen value in the Torah. I want that spirituality. I want the part of Torah that is abstract. The part of Torah that's going to, so to speak, grow my neshama, but not necessarily address the realities of living in a physical world. Says this Mishnah, learning Torah is greater than having a Torah experience purely for the sake of the spiritual value. That's lesson one. Incidentally, parenthetically, the reason that we say there are 24 different elements that are the sign of the Kohen is because there were 24 gifts that the community had to designate for the Kohanim on a regular basis, the most famous of which obviously are the portions from the sacrifices and truma, but there are many others as well, including, like I mentioned, that you've got to send meat and that you've got to send the first wool of your sheep when you shear, etc. All in all, 24 gifts. It's quite interesting. I didn't see this in any of the sources, but it just struck me when I was reading this that the the gematria value of 24 is kad. And a kad is like a jar, a container, which is usually associated actually with truma, the gathering of your produce and putting them into the containers that you would then give. So I don't know if we often talk about kad hakemach, that you put flour into one of these kadim, into one of these earthenware jars. So perhaps there's a symbolism in that as well, that the number 24 actually represents the gifts that are given to the kohanim. So lesson one is, we should not pursue Torah just for the spiritual value that we're going to get, the kohen elements of Torah. We should study Torah. Why? Because it's Torah. And that's actually been the theme, if you think about it, of this chapter, is studying Torah for its sake, not for what I'm going to gain out of it, not because it's going to enrich me, turn me into a spiritual person, separate me from the world, elevate me above the world. That's not the motivation. The motivation is to study Torah for Torah's sake. That's a kohen. Now, what's a king? King is a little bit more tricky. The Jewish king is a very paradoxical reality. So if we're going to understand what the king aspect of Torah is, because now we understand what we're talking about, we're not comparing Torah to other roles in society that we cannot access. We're talking about the Kohen version of Torah. Now we're going to be talking about the royalty version of Torah. So if we want to talk about that, we have to understand what a king is in Judaism. As I say, it's a very paradoxical state. But before we get there, I want to just share something that the Maharal says, because it's very beautiful. The Maharal tells us that the reason that the king is associated with 30 milos, with 30 advantages, if you have a look at those advantages, basically what you see it's privileges. Certain privileges that the king has. So in the same way as the Kohen has 24 privileges that the community has to donate to them, the king has 30 privileges for being king. And that includes such things as he has to own fields, he has to own vineyards, he has to have servants, he has to have maidservants, he has to have various types of weapons, and depending on where you look, basically there's different places that list them slightly differently, so the weapons are split into different groups. He has to have a palace in addition to his other properties. He has to have a special Torah over and above the Torah that everybody else writes. There are certain privileges that relate to how the nation has to respect him. Nobody's allowed to sit on his throne. Nobody's allowed to use his scepter. Nobody's allowed to marry his widow. Nobody's allowed to testify against him. He's not called to court as a witness. So you go on and on. There's 30 different privileges that the king has. So the Maharal says the reason there are 30 privileges associated with the king is because 30 is the expansion of the number 3. So you take 3 and you take it, like we've already learned before, that you have a number and then all the 10 facets that make up the reality of this world. So you take the 3 and expand it out into its 10 facets. You get the 10 privileges per 3 elements. What are the 3 elements? There are 3 mitzvahs that apply uniquely to a king. And that is, or 3 restrictions that apply uniquely to the king.
Too much material.
He may not have too much gold and silver. He may not marry too many wives. Of course, you understand the big question is how many is too many wives? And I once heard that the difference between polygamy and monogamy, please don't be offended, I just once heard this, is that polygamy is marrying more wives than you can handle, and monogamy is the same. So he may not marry too many wives, and he may not have too many horses. So those are the 3 key mitzvahs that are associated, or restrictions that are associated with the king. You expand those out, says the Maharal, you get 30 elements, and that's why he has 30 privileges. But then he tells us something which is really fascinating, and actually quite beautiful if you have a look at it. How do you say king in Hebrew? Melech, right? Melech. Now what's unique about Melech is it's one of the few words in Hebrew where you've got it's a 3-letter word, obviously. We've got the central letter accompanied on either side by the letters that both precede and follow it in the alphabet, even though it's in reverse order, but it's got those letters on either side. So the middle letter is a lamed, and then on the right-hand side, you've got the mem, which is the letter after lamed, and on the left-hand side, you've got a chof, which is the letter before the lamed. Lamed itself is considered a middle letter in the alphabet. Right? Lamed and mem are considered the middle letters in the alphabet. What's also interesting about a lamed is that it is a letter that extends higher than all the other letters. It's the only letter that we have that extends above the line. So most letters are in the middle. Some letters go below the line, particularly final letters. And lamed is the unique letter that goes above the line. I'm not talking about cursive. When you write cursive, then you might do a final tzaddik above the line. But in what we call ksav ashuris, which is the script of the Torah, lamed is the only one that goes above the line. So you've got a mem on the one side, you've got a chof on the other side, you've got the lamed in the middle. That is a visual representation of what a king is. Because the king, if you remember back in the days of the very first person who was ever identified as a Jewish king, which was Shaul, King Saul, so the Tanakh describes him as Mishich moi v'maylo gavoya mikol ha'am, that he was head and shoulders, and this is the origin of the phrase, above the nation, head and shoulders above the nation. So you would see that somebody is taller than everybody else if they're standing alongside other people. So this is what Melech represents. You've got the mem letter on the one side, you've got the chof letter on the other side, and in the middle you've got the lamed, which towers over both of them. So that represents royalty. Royalty is that you stand above the crowd. Then the Maharal asks this question. Isn't it interesting that if you're building up, because we know that every letter in the alphabet has a numerical value, so if you're building up and then you hit the letter lamed, so now you're at the value 30, and suddenly it's a tall letter, the logic would suggest that the next letter should be taller, and the next letter should be taller, and so it should go, because there's obviously, these are not accidental things, that letters are depicted in a particular way. It obviously represents what spiritual energy they represent. So what is it over here about this lamed that it's the tallest letter, and then we kind of go back to the regular sizes afterwards. And he says you'll know the answer to that from the story of Mount Sinai. So it's good we're learning this now, coming up for the holiday of Shavuos. What's the story? It's a paradox. Mount Sinai is a massive paradox because on the one hand, it's a mountain. And on the other hand, we know that it is considered, what's the expression? Does anybody know the expression that the Gemara uses about Mount Sinai that it's considered? Right, that's the thing. It doesn't use the word exactly. Uses the word mochich mikol Torah, that it was lower than the other mountains. Which other mountains? Har Tavor and Har Carmel. Those are the mountains that are referred to in the Gemara. and Sinai is shorter than them. So now here's the paradox. Why is Sinai a shorter mountain? Why? What does it represent? Humility. So if you're looking for humility, why do you choose a mountain?
Because it's
Surely it would have made much more sense to present the Torah on a plain or in a valley if you wanted to represent humility. So it's a mountain, and yet it's not a mountain. It's a mountain, but it's far from the tallest mountain. For what reason? That is the paradox of leadership. That is the paradox of the Melech. The paradox of the Melech is, on the one hand, head and shoulders above the rest of the nation. On the other hand, you stand amongst your people. The Lamed is in the middle. It is amongst the nation. He doesn't separate himself from the people. And that's why you see David HaMelech, he says to the nation, he calls them Achai va'ami, my brothers first, va'ami, and my nation. Because the attitude of a king is supposed to be, on the one hand, recognizing that this is a leadership position, and therefore you have to have certain assets that the rest of the community doesn't have, and therefore you stand tall, which is all valid, and it's all true, yet you have to stand b'soichami ani yoshaves, which is not obviously from David HaMelech, or any king for that matter, but it's the same principle, right? That you stand and you are found within and amongst the people. Therefore, says the Maharal, the Lamed is between the Mem and the Chaf, which are the letters that represent the nation. Now, what was the word that we used for how low Sinai is? We used the word mochech, which comes from that word Mem Chaf. That's what it comes from. In fact, the Gemara tells us that there are various places in Tehillim where there's a very odd word. The word is michtam. Michtam leDavid. Michtam leDavid. So the Gemara asks, what is michtam? What does it mean? So the Gemara says it's two words that have been put together. The one word is the word mach, and the other word is the word tam. Tam is sincere or whole. And mach is meek or humble. So the Melech, the Lamed, which is the tall letter, is in the middle, because that's obviously the core of what it is to be a king. You have to be a leader. The king cannot be somebody who second guesses themselves, who walks around with a poor self-esteem. That's not going to work as a king. They have to stand tall, and at the same time, Mem Chaf is on either side, Mach. At the same time, they have this incredible humility. Who would represent that? Who'd be the best example of what a king is supposed to be? Well, we know who, right? Obviously, it has to be David HaMelech. For no other reason except the fact that he is always used as the icon of a king. But let's analyze David HaMelech for one moment. Do you remember the story when Shmuel, the prophet, is told by Hashem that he has to find a new king of Israel? And he tells him, where you got to go? To the family of Yishai. So there Shmuel, Hanavi, comes to Yishai, knocks on the door. Yishai, I know you have a few sons. Apparently one of them is going to be a king. Can I do a quick spiritual scan of your sons? It's not like an interview, where you speak to them and say, if you were king, what would you do? It's Shmuel coming in with his laser eyes and his prophetic vision and scanning each son and saying, not him, not him, not him. So at that point, initially in the first lineup, somebody's missing in the initial lineup, right? David's not even there. He's the shepherd. He's out looking after the sheep. And one by one, Shmuel says, not this son. And eventually he says, anybody else? If you got anybody else? And where do you think they got it from? And so the Tanakh tells us at that point, it calls David HaKatan. David is the smallest, youngest, most junior of all of his brothers. The Gemara says that is not just about his position in the family, and we won't even talk about the scandal that they thought was associated with David's birth. That's a subject for another conversation. But the Gemara says, you know why he's called Katan? Because the Jewish people are called Katan. We're called a nation that is a small or diminutive nation. And the reason we are that way is because we are compared to the moon, which is considered the Katan. So the Gemara tells us, very interesting Gemara, I'm sure you know it. Everybody knows the Gemaras, right? So, but you definitely know this Gemara. It's a famous story where at the beginning of creation, the Torah tells us that Hashem created Shnei HaMa'oros HaGedolim, the two great luminaries. And then in the same breath it says, Es Amora Godolim Mimshelas HaYom, Es Amora Kotalim Mimshelas HaLayla, the great luminary for the day, the small luminary for the night. The Gemara says, how did that happen? You started the sentence saying the two great luminaries, and you concluded the sentence by saying one great and one small. What happened? Says the Gemara very famously, the moon complained. So for those people who grew up on those stories, what was his name? Charles Herman Bosman. The stories of how did the giraffe get its long neck, and it's the same. It sounds like the same thing. Lahavdil. The moon complains to Hashem and says, It's not possible that you could have two kings who have to share a crown. So Hashem says to the moon, you're right. Strange conversation. Okay, so Hashem didn't know this. He needed the moon to tell him. And he says to the moon, you're right. Okay, what does this mean? You have to diminish yourself. And so up until that point, the moon somehow generated light. And ever since then, the moon can only reflect light. And then Hashem says, every Rosh Chodesh we have to bring a goat as one of the offerings, symbolically bringing a chatas sin offering on behalf of Hashem, because Havu alai kapora, Hashem says, bring an atonement for me, al shemi atati es hayoreach, because I diminished the moon. So a fascinating subject, deserves a shir in its own regard, which we're not going to do now. But what is significant is, at that point, the consolation that Hashem gives the moon is, don't worry, some of the best people in history are katan, are small people. Namely, the Jewish nation as a whole, and David HaMelech, and this is where the Gemara makes this reference. So you have King David, who is the source of the entire lineage of Jewish royalty. King Saul was just a temporary state. It was never what Hashem intended. It was what the people asked for. But David is the beginning of the lineage of kings, so he is the greatest king of all. Think about it logically. Anybody who initiates a process must obviously have the greatest power for that process. Otherwise, how do you get it started? Like anything else, to initiate a process takes the greatest energy. On the one hand, David HaMelech is the greatest king. Even Moshiach is going to be called on David's name. And yet, he's considered katan, small, because that is the paradox of Jewish royalty, of Jewish leadership. A Jewish king, is not somebody who has intrinsic power. They have inherent talent and inherent greatness, but they have absolutely no personal power. The power lies in the nation. So the nation has to appoint the king, or the nation has to acknowledge that they want the person who's appointed as the king to be their king. And you actually see that in David's life, that he has to spend many years campaigning before he's actually accepted as a king throughout the nation. Initially, he's just a king in Hebron, in his own little enclave. So that's the paradox of a king. There's another paradox of the king. And that is, at the end of the day, all the sophistication for which the king deserves to be the king, which is probably a very advanced intellect and a very deep spiritual nature, because to be a king in Judaism is not just because you're a strategist and a military person. You have to have a deep spiritual connection. On the other hand, the irony of the king is, what part of the king do we get to relate to? How many people ever have the opportunity to experience the king's deep intellect or their great spiritual connection? The nation generally, how does the nation generally relate to the king?
Oh, like we do to Hashem.
Which is how? How do we?
We serve him.
In other words, good, so we serve him. So what does that mean? So what does that actually mean?
We acknowledge him.
It means we do what he says. That's our relationship with the king. We do what he says. If we don't do what he says, then we're in contempt, and that could, God forbid, be even a capital offense. So how do you exhibit your relationship with the king? By doing what he says. Right? So you got the king that is very tall, represented by the Lamed, this very elevated person in the community. And by the way, the Maharal points out Lamed obviously has the gematria value of 30. Therefore, there are 30 attributes that the king has. And that's what illustrates his greatness. But tachlis, the way that we interact with the king has nothing to do with that greatness. The way we interact with the king is actually linking in to the most basic part of the king's life, which is telling us what to do. There's no depth to that. There must be good reason why he's choosing for us to do these things, but we're not getting that. We don't get to understand the backstory of the royal decree. We just have to follow the royal decree. And so that's another way of learning Torah, which is the approach. Why do I learn Torah? I learn Torah because I need to know what to do. Because it's important as a Jewish person, practically to know what I'm supposed to do as a Jewish person. So I acknowledge that there's tremendous greatness and depth and profundity in the Torah, but I'm learning because I need to know what to do. So that's the person who learns Torah from a perspective of Malchus. Why are they learning Torah? Because they want the royal aspect of the Torah. They want to know the decrees. Now, that's great because it shows that a person has a tremendous dedication to Torah. The Gemara tells us famously that we already saw it in the Mishnah, but the Gemara also tells us that the main thing is not the learning but the doing, or the famous Gemara which says, well, which one is greater, Talmud or Maise, and eventually it says Maise Gadol, and then it says Talmud Gadol, Shemevi Lidei Maise, that the ultimate reason you learn Torah is in order to bring to action. So somebody's saying, the reason I want to learn Torah is because I want to know what to do, because that's really, really important. As a Jewish person, I need to know what to do. So therefore, this Mishnah comes along to tell us, Gedola Torah, Yosem Min HaMalchus. Torah, learning Torah for Torah's sake, Lishma, where I'm learning Torah because Hashem wants me to learn Torah, is even greater than learning Torah because I want to know what to do. Although it's critical that I should know what to do. It's a fundamental part of being Jewish, is I need to know how to behave as a Jewish person. And it sounds like it's probably an even better reason to learn Torah than because I want to have this deep spiritual experience like the Kohen. Even so, the ultimate state of learning Torah is to learn Torah for Torah's sake. In order to get to that, the Mishnah is going to list for us 48 different considerations that a person has to engage in so that they can learn Torah for Torah's sake. And this is the difference between the first two, which he calls milos. So the Kohen has milos and the king has milos, which are attributes or privileges, whereas the 48 aspects of Torah are called devarim, things. The reason for that is because you can inherit a milah. So for example, a person may genetically inherit the talent of their parents. So you have a person who's very intelligent, and their child inherits that intelligence. In the same way, a person inherits the kahuna, and therefore with it all the privileges that the kahuna brings. And a person inherits the rights to be a king because they come from the royal family. So milos don't tell us anything about what you've achieved. They only tell us about what you receive. In order to get to Torah, and particularly to be able to learn Torah Lishma, it has nothing to do with what you've received. Nothing at all. It's devarim, it's things that we do. And that's what the Mishnah wants to distinguish. It wants to tell us that fundamentally, in order for a person to truly experience the real value of what Torah is, it's about personal investment. And personal investment, as we shall see as we go through the list, in areas, some of which are particularly challenging. Some of the things are practical. You'll see it's kind of almost divided into different segments. Some are practical. It tells us how you should learn. Others are practical in terms of who you should learn with and how you should engage with the people you learn with. But some of them are very emotional in a sense, how we react to things that happen in our lives. And effectively, each of these devarim is like a whole world in its own right, things that we have to work on, that we have to develop in order to be in a position that we should be able to receive Torah. And again, you have a look at 48. So 48, again, I didn't see this in a book, but it must be in a book somewhere. Probably saw it in a book some time ago and forgot, and then thought I made it up myself. So 48 is the gematria of moyach, which is the mind, and usually the brain. Usually we think that the brain is purely just an intellectual tool, and over here we're seeing that in order for a person to learn Torah, we need the brain to be more than just an intellectual tool. It needs to become a godly tool, and that way we can access what the Torah truly is.
And that's where the greatest light in the world is, in the brain.
And sometimes above.
Yes.
Okay, so with that, we haven't started the list. There's still 48 things to learn. I don't believe it will take us 48 weeks, but it probably will take us more than one. So please God, next week we'll start to actually examine the items on the list, trying to see them in clusters, because that makes it a little bit easier to learn. But we'll see how it goes.
So we have been